Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eve Patton. I'm director of the Trinity Longroom Hub, which is Trinity's research institute for the arts and humanities. And the Hub is really proud that we are able to help host this innovative conference on the work of Shirley Jackson. I, like all of you, have read some of Jackson's work and also the letters that my colleague Bernice Murphy recently worked on with Lawrence Jackson Hyman. I am, like all of you, intrigued by this author and her ability to make the everyday into the uncanny and the uncanny into the everyday. This conference is also about reading Shirley Jackson in the 21st century. So it's a very welcome intervention on criticism. How are our critical values and hierarchies developing in this new century, and how have we perhaps developed better critical skills for understanding a much wider range of crossover and so-called commercial fiction in contemporary approaches. So a very welcome conference and a very welcome lineup, which you'll be hearing more about in a minute. But let me pay tribute to our Trinity-based team, Bernice, Janice, and Dara, who have compiled a really special portfolio on Jackson and Jackson criticism for this event. So thank you for your work. I know it's going to be a pleasure for me to listen in. Everyone who tweets, please do tweet about this. Janice will put the handle and relevant details into the chat function for you. I hope all of you enjoy this session, and I'll now hand over to my colleague, Bernice Murphy.
Hi, everybody. Bernice Murphy here. So as Eve said, welcome to Reading Shirley Jackson in the 21st Century. This is Shirley Jackson's 105th birthday, so happy birthday, Shirley. And we are genuinely delighted to be here today and have you all here today for this celebration and exploration of Jackson's work and her literary legacy. It's also an exploration of the past, the present, and the future of Jackson's studies. And as such, we have assembled a kind of a Marvel cinematic universe, or if you're an older like me, a Dirty Dozen style assemblage of crack Jackson scholars from every corner of the world that are here with us today. Now, in recent years, Jackson has re-emerged as a major figure in the pop culture and the literary landscape. And as such, we feel that it is the ideal time for an informed and expansive discussion of the implications of this truly remarkable, and I hope we all agree, much deserved Renaissance. So I myself, I am an associate professor and lecturer in popular literature here in the School of English, Trinity College, Dublin. I myself have a long-term research interest in Jackson's work, and I'm also a huge for writing. So it is on many levels a true pleasure and an honor to be with you here today. We have a packed schedule, so I'll not keep you any longer. First of all, we have a few other minor housekeeping and technical issues and scheduling issues to discuss. So I'm going to hand over to my first of my esteemed co-organizers, Dara Downey. So Dara.
Thanks, Bernice. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. So hello, good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Dara Downey, and I lecture in English in the Trinity Access Programme, as well as in a few other places. And I'm currently writing a literary biography of Shirley Jackson for the Palgrave Literary Live series. So we're really delighted to have you all here this evening, and we're particularly delighted that Reading Shirley Jackson in the 21st Century is a genuinely international event. As Bernice says, we have panelists and audience members from all over the world, and it's really nice that Ireland is playing such a major role in all of this. And we're also thrilled to be able to hold this event via the Trinity Longroom Hub. Trinity, and particularly the School of English here, it has a long-standing interest in popular literature, and Jackson's writing has been central to a lot of the work that's being done in the School of English in this regard. And in fact, it was Bernice who introduced me to Jackson's writing many, many years ago, when I first started my PhD, and helped to shape the course of my research ever since. So we really hope that this event is going to help highlight the newfound momentum that we think has emerged in Jackson's studies, that's happening worldwide. And as well, we want to, kind of help celebrate the excellent work that's being done, that has been done over the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. Work that really helps to kind of bring this unduly neglected writer back into the spotlight. So before I hand over to my colleague Janice Deitner, here is a quick reminder of the schedule and the running order for this evening. So we have 3 panels and they'll focus on the speakers in the panel more or less, but there'll also be time for questions. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Janice.
Thank you, Dara. Hello, my name is Janice Steitner, and I'm a third-year PhD student in Trinity College School of English, working on Shirley Jackson. I want to take a moment to remind you that this is a hybrid event. We have a variety of contributions from Jackson scholars on our conference website, and I will put that information in the chat. The material will be available after the event tonight, and we will continue adding to it, so we encourage you to keep visiting the site. You can also find the full bios of our speakers on the website, and we will share links to those bios at the start of each panel. If you have any questions for the speakers during the event, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can leave questions at any time. Please specify who the questions are for. The chat is disabled for attendees. However, we have a Discord server where there is already a lively conversation going on. As Eve mentioned, we are also on Twitter at ShirleyCon 2021, and I'll put the tags there in the chat. Without further delay, I would like to hand things back to Dara for our first panel on the critical heritage of Jackson studies. So back to you, Dara.
Sorry, didn't want to unmute there for a second. Oh, okay, I think I should be unmuted now. So, hello and welcome to, as Janice says, our first panel, which is focusing on the kind of the critical heritage, what has been done so far in terms of criticism, focusing on Shirley Jackson's work. And we have 3 panelists. As Janice says, you can find their full biographies on our website. We have Jill Anderson, who's an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at Tennessee State University. We have Shelley Ingram, who's an associate professor of English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And we also have Faye Ringel, who is a professor emerita of humanities at the US Coast Guard Academy. So yeah, we're just going to kind of ease into it gently, I think, first of all. So I suppose I would like to ask all of you how you first came across Shirley Jackson's writing and what drew you to her. So I suppose if we go in the order that I can see you. So Faye, would you like to kick us off there?
Yes, I'd be delighted. It seems that I've always read Jackson. I read We Have Always Lived in the Castle when it first appeared, when I was far too young and I'm sure didn't understand what was going on, but it haunted me. And I sought out The Haunting of Hill House, of course, read The Lottery in high school, as so many students do, and then just grabbed everything else that I could. And of course, that was all in the 1960s. And I also began working on I remember her death. I mean, that was, I was a fan that young. And I had begun working on the New England Gothic even that early. And Jackson just seemed to incarnate so many of the things that I loved about what came to be called folk horror. I think that's it.
Hey, we might come back to that folk horror tag actually in a minute, because I think that that's kind of a major thing actually in the way that Jackson's work is getting received. So, okay, just again, in the order that I can see people. Jill, do you want to let us know how you found Jackson or how she found you?
I don't know my exact origin story. I know it's been fairly recent, but I am a reformed Faulknerian and had kind of painted myself into a little bit of a corner with my dissertation. And so by the time I figured out my dissertation was not going to be my first book, I had completely abandoned all of the theory that I had done in my PhD because one of my friends said to me, and isn't this true sometimes with academics, like it takes our friends to tell us what we're studying. She's like, you're working on horror. That's what you're dealing with. That's what you want to write about, clearly. And I had picked up Jackson several times and taught her novels several times and just kind of fell in love from start to finish with everything, really.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what exactly you fell in love with? Sorry if that's not too personal.
No, it's not. Like I said, I had painted myself into a corner with my dissertation because I was focusing on literature of the 1960s, which is so sort of white man dominated. And so when American lit, I should say. And so when I discovered her as a woman, you know, writing and publishing in the 40s and the 50s, and writing in this vein where she was sort of, I love stuff that's hard to categorize and kind of slippery. And that's what I loved about it. I couldn't exactly describe to people exactly what was going on in the stories. And I find that very fun and empowering. But really that sort of element of just like, everything's just a little fuzzy. Everything's just a little off. I know we call it the uncanny in various things, but that's been a major thing that's kept me coming back.
Thanks, Jill. That was great. Shirley, what about you?
So I'm a folklorist primarily, and I study folklore and literature. So I'm in an English department and I teach literature classes, but everything that I teach comes from the perspective of a folklorist, right? So I was getting ready about 10 years ago to teach a class called, I think it was Folklore in the American Gothic. And a friend of mine said, why don't you have any Shirley Jackson on here? And I was like, you know, you're right. Why don't I? I only read The Lottery. That was all I had read at that point. So We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And the first time I read it, my students and I read it together. So we kind of were able to discover this novel together. And that was really it was such an incredible kind of week of discussion in that class. So for me, Jackson's work is tied very closely to teaching. And because of how she writes about being a writer, so much of her work is also about writing. Being able to discover that with students in the classroom just really added this dimension to her novels that I really fell in love with again. And so I went back and read, and then I read The Haunting of Hill House. And when I closed it, I was like, well, that's the perfect novel. And my interest in folklore makes reading it delightful every time, because every time I read it, I think about a new way in which she's incorporating kind of folk traditions and folk knowledge into her work. And that's just brilliant.
It is. It's really great. Yeah, I kind of had a similar experience the first time that I read We've Always Lived in the Castle. I remember where I was sitting in the post-grad common room, and I actually think that I read it all in one sitting, and I closed it and I looked up, and the person who is now my ex was like, where did you go for the last few hours, Dara? And I was like, I was in there. That's where I was. I just kind of vanished into it. And yeah, like all of you, it kind of, I don't know, it changed my perspective on things. I mean, when Bernice first suggested that I read these books, I was going to write my PhD on everything frightening in American space ever. All of it. Largely thanks to having read Faye's book when I was in second year. But yeah, she kind of changed the course of a lot of things for me. Faye, you were really nodding along there. Have you had similar experiences of teaching Jackson's work, or?
Not really, no. I'm just fascinated by the success that you've had in teaching her work. No, mine has always been through living it. Through Jackson, I began. As many of the initial readers of The Lottery, my folklore expeditions as a young person were to find out where these lotteries were being held. I've really thought that I was so convinced that somewhere in New England there must still be a lottery going on or something like it. And then I too had a great interest in folklore and was fascinated by the way she did not incorporate specific New England legends at all, and yet she managed to bring in the feeling of those legends, the guilt, all of the family secrets, the things that we don't talk about, the mad women in the attic, that was just so I'm so thrilled to be on a panel and to find out about Shelley, and I hope that we'll be able to speak more.
I hope so too. Yeah, so I mean, I guess from what all of you are saying, it kind of seems like, you know, when you first encountered Jackson, that she was someone who, like, people knew her work. Maybe you had read one thing by her, but on the other hand, she kind of wasn't on the radar. So, I mean, do you think, can any of you account for why this is, for why she was critically and publicly neglected for so long?
I can jump in and talk to
Yeah,
that
please.
a little bit. I think it has to do with that slipperiness, first of all, because if we, you know, not to get too deep in the weeds of you know, American literature departments in the second half of the 20th century, but again, always white, male, identified, dominated, but also the sort of teaching profession, we're sort of taught we have to teach these sort of like chronologies, or these works from these anthologies that sort of represent some kind of bigger theme in American literature. And so often some of the writers that I value, I look at this and I'm like, okay, this isn't this isn't this. And so we weren't handed those sorts of things in our training. And so I just love her genre shifting. And I think that's part of the reason why we just haven't seen her so much. And I also think we have kind of an unhealthy relationship to some of our literature anthologies, just FYI, but that's a whole other story.
Yes, it is. Having spent the afternoon trying to tell students how to cite the Norton Anthology of American Literature, I feel your pain. It's no fun. Faye, yeah.
I think that there are sort of two things going on there. Bernice has spelled out several times, as have others, the relative critical neglect between her death and the new century. So between 1965 and 2000, but I was an exception to that. I did write about Jackson in my book, and as I was researching it in the early 90s, I did come across some real, should I say, an anecdote that seems to point this out. I called Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which at that time held the rights and had kept some of her earlier novels out of print for some time, for permission to quote from The Haunting of Hill House, and got an intern who had never heard of Shirley Jackson. Intern passed me along to someone higher up who had a vague memory that she was one of their authors, and went off looking and came back and said, there is no such book as The Haunting of Hill House. And I said, not possible. And she said, I do have an index card that's something about the haunted house on the hill. And I said, that's probably it. And she said, oh, quote as much as you like, who cares?
Funny. Oh my God. So it was literally category error, right? This was like, actually didn't know where to put her. Shelley, do you want to weigh in here?
I'll just echo what Jill and Faye have said, in that, you know, she has the fact that she's read as genre fiction in the American Academy is a real kind of roadblock, because genre fiction doesn't belong in our universities. It doesn't belong in the literary canon. And add to that she's a woman, you know, and you can see why people would be dismissive of her work. But I do think that that's true. And because it was weird, you know, it was weird. She was writing weird stuff. Like, what do you do with Mary Cat? You know, like, what do you do with a character like that? But I will say that I think one area in which she's never been neglected is in kind of writing. So, you know, I always talk about her as a writer's writer, and that creative writing friends and professors that I know have taught her, you know, have kind of kept her going in the, like I had a friend who said, or I was told that she's taught the first paragraph of Castle pretty much every year since she's taught creative writing. So, you know, there are pockets where her work has kind of never gone away. But sure, you know, I asked to teach a major figures course, a major authors course, and I told them I was going to teach Shirley Jackson, and one of the responses was, well, if I felt like arguing about that with you, I would say she's not a major author. Yeah, so but I taught it anyway, and it was fabulous. And now we had like 3 students do master's thesis on Jackson, and so, you know, whatever. But you know, I think her like being categorized, well, the kind of prejudices against genre fiction, the fact that she's a woman, and just that it was weird. I think those all kind of combined to keep her off the radar of critical and popular readers.
And I think too, add to that so much of her fiction appeared in women's magazines, which, you know, has been written about before, but it's always good to remember that that sort of division between lowbrow and highbrow, you know, the lowbrow fiction that appears in magazines, especially women's magazines, and the highbrow literary stuff that we read and study and take seriously, was also a huge contributor to that. But also, you know, Shelley, like, teach, right? Teach what's going to make sense, right?
Exactly. Faye?
Just to come back to that interstitial time, the other area in which Jackson was never forgotten or neglected was those people who love and read and wrote horror. And Bernice has several times talked about being inspired by Stephen King's Danse Macabre, his journey through his formation, which has a fascinating section on Jackson, one of the few people writing about the sundial at a time when it was out of print, and it was pretty rare. And Dara and a collaborator have written a wonderful kind of response to Danse Macabre and Stephen King that is found in the collection of Jackson essays on the literary legacy. And this there's no doubt that King knew and loved Jackson, as did many other writers of American horror writers. So that was an area. And then Danse Macabre was 1982. So.
Oh yeah. And yeah, I always think it's really funny that, like, Stephen King he's quite snooty about people like Henry James and Edith Wharton. You know, he's like, oh, well, they're too highbrow for me. Jackson, you know, Jackson is fine. She's kind of somewhere in the middle. And yet at the same time, he's like, oh, well, you know, I'd never be as subtle as she is. And I think that even just that is a really good example of her sort of awkward middle ground status, that she's not quite popular enough for the popular people, and she's not quite literary, whatever that means, enough for the literary people. And yeah, things kind of fall between the cracks. I mean, not to abuse my position as chair here, but like, one of the things that I've been thinking about as well is that possibly what happened is that, you know, so she very sadly passes away in 1965, and she was just about to finish or to write Come Along With Me, and it was also exciting. And she, you know, she has this heroine who is going off doing her own thing, and she's fairly frank about her relationship with the supernatural, and that never happens. And then, like, you start moving from 1965 into 1966, 1968, the world changes very rapidly. And I suppose I was kind of wondering, I know that the critical kind of commonplace idea is that she wasn't really a feminist, or she wouldn't have wanted to have thought of herself as a feminist. But, like, do you think she was coming out with the wrong kind of feminism for the 60s? And that if she had lived, you know, that next book would maybe have tapped a little bit more into the zeitgeist, and that she somehow got kind of left behind because she wasn't seen as being trendy enough? I don't know, sorry, I know this is a left field question, but it's something I've been thinking about.
Well, the killer review by Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique of Jackson's domestic fiction humor, which is a total misreading of those stories, and putting her with Irma Bombeck and Jean Kerr, and as though they were all happy, contented housewives, and the idea that killer review really did, I think, did damage among, and then the other thing is that the second wave feminists and when they rediscovered the American women who wrote ghost stories but were also regionalists who were dismissed as local colorists. In that initial rediscovery, most signified by the addition of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, there was a real tendency to downplay the supernatural. A great many in the 60s and 70s, the right into the 80s, those feminist rediscoveries and theory were really shying away from the ghost story as ghost story, and from the Gothic, maybe in reaction to the popularity of the women's Gothic of the 60s and 70s. But I agree with Dara that that things might have been different, but I think it took the current generation of feminists to be willing to embrace every aspect of Jackson.
Shelley, you're nodding along there.
I just agree that I think she's really well positioned right now where the state of feminist kind of theory and criticism is. Like she's someone that can be rediscovered, and she's in a really good position for that, because I think so much of the early kind of feminist readings of her text were categorical, right? Were about slotting her into feminist or not feminist, or trying to fit her into a category, that they missed the way, obviously, her work is so speaks so deeply to a woman's experiences of the time, right? Like trying to think of her as as an activist, or as someone who was seeking to change the world was not going to fly, because that was just not her interest, right? So I think she's very well positioned for this, like Faye said, this kind of new generation, this new way of thinking about identity, in terms of gender and sex, and sexuality, right? I think this is I'm very excited about the kind of where I see contemporary criticism going with her work.
Jill, was that a hand that I saw a minute ago?
Technically no, but I was just thinking, I can't think about Jackson's writing without thinking about, and I know this is supposed to be critical heritage, but I can't think without the writers who are writing now that call her a direct influence, right? Like Carmen Maria Machado, or Otesha Moshfegh, or Paul Tremblay, right? All of those people writing the kind of new American Gothic, who have recognized that so often that the horror doesn't have to be supernatural. It doesn't have to be something huge and something old that lives in the forest, going back to our Puritan horror stories that we had, but that they're this sort of accumulation of trauma, this sort of everyday kind of traumatic experience of living as whatever, or whomever. And so whenever I think about that, then and thinking about the critical heritage, it's so easy to see that sort of everyday mundane horror that appears over and over and over again is something that we're really starting to see people are much more equipped and much more enthusiastic to talk about. And that makes me really happy and makes me really hopeful for what's to come, which, you know, our third panel will talk about. But this idea that it doesn't have to be some sort of grand horror or some sort of horror that's lived with us for thousands and thousands of years. It's a cumulative sort of thing.
And that it also doesn't have to be an either or situation. You know, we don't have to read her as either just domestic and realist or just supernatural and non-realist. That, like, you can hold those two things up in the air at the same time, however head melty that might be.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, one of the other things that I guess, like, one of the big elephants in the room in terms of the way that she's been written about, say, kind of particularly in the latter half of the 20th century following her passing, is that there tends to be one or two texts that have dominated the critical discourse. So specifically The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, do you think that there's any reason for this, or, like, how do you feel about it? Do you think that this is a reasonable response to her writing, or?
To be perfectly honest, I'm of two minds for this. I'm always one of those people who's like, whatever gets people in the door, I don't care. But also at the same time, again, I think it has a lot to do with our fetishization of literature anthologies and what gets put in there. And one of the things I always think about with authors whose one thing is heavily anthologized, I'm always like, but what do you think they would want? So that's a question I've always thought of with, you know, people like Shirley Jackson. What story would she want to be taught? Would it be The Lottery? I don't know, right? But I think, yes, they've been dominated by these two works. And I think those of us who work on her literature recognize that. And we are specifically kind of trying to steer people away a bit, but there's still a lot to be done, especially with Hill House. There's still a ton of work, and if people can publish on old text over and over and over again, like, why not?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Godspeed to them. Shelley, were you? Oh, sorry. I think, yeah, Faye, you go first.
The part of it was, just to return to what I said before, is that the earlier novels were out of print for a long time. So, I mean, after all, the idea that they've been reprinted in the Library of America is pretty astounding, but it did take until 2020 for that to happen. And on the other hand, The Lottery is among the two most anthologized stories in American literature. The other one is The Yellow Wallpaper. So certainly that not surprising that you're going to have much more scholarship on that. And again, even though the other short stories have been collected and printed, they are, as she said, much less anthologized. So there's plenty of material. Even Hattenauer, writing a whole book about Jackson, refers to her small output. I mean, at one point, it's not small by any stretch of the imagination, and yet really is a small number of short stories that have tended to attract all of the attention. And then I think the other thing is going back to what everyone else has said, that and what you said, how is it possible to look at the same time at her domestic fiction and her horror fiction and make sense? Only now are we getting those holistic the kind of holistic criticism that doesn't just try to separate things.
Yeah, I think, as people have been saying, you know, critics and the public are getting a bit more comfortable with ambiguity and with kind of a lack of categories. Shelley, were you going to add something there?
I was just going to add that Hill House is an incredible novel, right? And that there will, like Jill said, there will always be things to say about it. Always. But, you know, of course it is it is frustrating, especially now with the Netflix series, which I won't talk about. It's so much that I would say.
Maybe later.
What?
Maybe later, but yeah.
Yes, maybe later. But you know, so we're going to have a new kind of generation of readership coming to Hill House because of the Netflix series. So I think we're just going to have to be, you know, we're just prepared for it. And then once we, you know, I had a kind of a friend say to me once, you gotta hook them with the fun stuff, and then you bring them in, and then you show them the real stuff, right? So if that's, like Jill said, you know, if that's what gets people interested in her work, then let's do it. And there's nothing wrong. Like, Hill House is brilliant, right? You know, and once they read Hill House, then I'll make them read Hangs a Man, which, you know, is maybe more brilliant. And it's great. Like, the more the merrier. I don't have much to say about the lottery, to be honest.
That's okay. You don't have to. But yeah, I think you're right. You kind of you soften your students up with the ones that they expect, and then they get a little bit more used to her way of doing things, a little bit more used to the kind of the uncertainty, and then wham, you hit them with the slightly odder stuff. And actually, yeah, I was thinking there when Faye was talking, sorry, again, another slightly left field question. But, you know, I mean, okay, you just said that the two most anthologized stories in American literature are The Lottery and The Yellow Wallpaper. And yet at the same time, as we've all been saying, you know, there's this real discomfort with the Gothic in American culture. And yet, as like Leslie Fiedler says, you know, the kind of canonical American literature is a literature of terror for boys, that it's, you know, like it's Hawthorne, it's Poe, it's Melville. And I don't know, I mean, how do we reconcile these things? Like, what is it about American literature being kind of fascinated by this stuff and yet also wanting to disavow it at the same time? Jill, go on. No, or whoever. Hey.
Well, I think part of it is that both of them are deceptively easy to read and yet encode so many meanings that and they're short, and that you could read either one and just seem to know so much about the rebellion against the patriarchy or scapegoating in American life and literature, that they're more often read allegorically. I mean, when they're taught, or if you look at the editions for teaching, if you look at the questions that come after in anthologies, particularly high school anthologies, the word Gothic is never mentioned, heaven knows. And instead, they're almost read almost completely as allegories.
And also, people don't have to think about what short stories by women they're going to put in their anthology, right? They don't have to think about it. They're like, well, we're just going to put these two, and we're good. We're done. So there's a bit of kind of inertia. Not that they're not great stories, because they are both wonderful stories, right? And they teach very well. But you know, it also shows us the kind of inertia of canon formation in American literature, that like, this is just, you know, we do this, we're good. We don't have to worry about anything else.
I think that's very true. Jill, do you want to add anything there? Or?
And I think interesting, you know, they come to stand in as kind of guideposts for women's experience, I think too. And us as professors and our students, we get to kind of point to them and say, like, look, here is what happens when you know, here's what happens when society decides to punish, you know, a woman, a town, a community, whatever it is. But at the same time, I think it's really interesting when Faye said that the Gothic is never mentioned in context there, because what that would then do would force us to kind of recognize collectively that the Gothic has kind of always been a mode that has been in literature and has always been something, you know, that terror that has always been something that we have been considering. And and then that kind of carries us now into the 21st century, that terror has not gone away, that terror has increased and changed modes. And so it's sort of in some ways kind of taking away this, not that I don't believe this, but taking away from the ideal of American culture and literature. If we say like, nope, we've been Gothic from the start, like it makes it kind of harder to say, to idealize.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the whole point of the Gothic is that it is meant to be slightly under the radar anyway. It's meant to be sort of like, this is what we're not allowed to say. So yeah, it has a very uneasy relationship, I think, with them. So what we're going to do now, if you don't mind, is we're going to move over to the Q&A, and we have one question already from Brett Cox, who is the board of directors on the Shirley Jackson Award. So thank you, Brett, for that. That's very exciting. So Brett has said, you've all identified two main reasons for the historic lack of regard for Jackson's work. One being her status as a woman writer, and the other being her status as a writer of weird fiction. Which do you think was the greater factor, or is it equally both? I think this kind of follows on from what we've been saying. Anyone want to jump in there? Is her gender or her genre more of a problem? Okay.
Thank you, Brett. I'm so glad that because we didn't get to talk about the Shirley Jackson Awards, which is so important. The very idea that there is an award established to perpetuate her memory that recognizes current achievements in psychological suspense and the dark fantastic. So a great shout out for the Shirley Jackson Awards. And I think that it is equally both, and that it is equally both that has signaled her in the 21st century, that you have a figure who incarnates so much about the conflicts that now seem to be just so present in the in a society facing apocalyptic terrors. So, but I think it was both that uneasiness, that category failure, that genre bending, as well as gender problems. Yes.
Either of the other two of you?
I just think you can't think about one without the other with her. You know, this is it would be hard to separate the two, because she was a woman and she did write weird fiction. You know, I can't imagine a way in which we could separate them. But yeah, I think now it would be the weirdness, but I think when for her contemporary, for her peers, it was just I can't separate the two, because her gender identity has a direct connection on the type of weird fiction she writes. And her weird fiction is a way for her to work out questions of identity. So you can't separate the two.
I agree. Jill, do you want to weigh in there? No. Okay, well, actually moving on from that, we've got a couple of kind of related questions in the Q&A there. There's also one from Chris in the chat, which I'll come to in a minute. But so between them, Heidi Bax, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and Claire Clark have been kind of talking about not so much Jackson's own status as a writer as much as kind of the reception of her work, both among kind of readers and critics who are also readers. And so Heidi has suggested that, you know, she's asking how much of the Gothic has been kept out of the canon because it was seen primarily as women's reading and thus taken less seriously in academic settings, which I think is kind of what Shelley was saying there, that, you know, you can't separate these two things. So, I mean, do you think that there has been kind of gatekeeping in terms of what gets seen as canonical?
I think so. I mean, the very fact that we have, and you, as you and Bernice have said, a school of popular course, a division of popular literature as opposed to literature. It's like the marked term. There's the lion and the lioness. Well, there's literature, and then there's popular literature. So that I'm sure both of the questioners, I agree with you that in her own time, her very popularity made her a little strange. Many of the reviews of her work were kind of, wow, why is she so popular? sort of reviews. And then after her death, certainly, if anyone was paying attention to someone in Bennington, Vermont, it would be to Bernard Malamud, who was going to be the canonical figure, or to her other contemporary that she knew, Saul Bellow. These were the people that you were going to be writing about, and not this person who was just too popular, let alone popular with women.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, as Mark Yankovic says in a couple of his books, this was kind of the era of the invention of that sort of, the cool factor of finding something that no one else knew. And so if everyone did know it, then, it wasn't really cool enough in some way. And, those kind of academics like Stanley Edgar Hyman were all about the cool. That was all they cared about. Sorry, I'll keep that to myself. Claire Clark has also suggested that some of what was happening with early 20th century critics who were writing about popular genres was that they were laying down the law for what constituted a particular genre. So, this is what the Gothic is, what the Western is, or whatever, and that coming back to kind of what Jill was saying earlier, that this is the sort of thing that happens, to Jackson when she falls between two stools, that she doesn't really fit neatly into those categories.
Yes.
Okay, a couple of other people. Elizabeth Mullen has added, that the French Association of US Studies is hosting a conference in May or June 2022. And there's a link. In Bordeaux. Oh my God, if we could go to Bordeaux, that'd be nice. Okay, hold on. Yeah, I mean, I know that this is something that's kind of going to come up in later panels, but Theodora Jean has just asked that if we do accept the 20th century neglect of Shirley Jackson, what do we think is precipitating the kind of sea change that's happening at the moment? It's a huge question.
I'm only being half facetious when I say this, but I think, and I got a lot of questions about this when Mel Anderson and I were putting together the Shirley Jackson and Domesticity essay collection. Everybody wanted to talk about the witchcraft, and I'm only half joking when I say, I think it's the partly the sort of empowerment some women are feeling around the space of talking about witchcraft and tarot and all the, and again, Jackson's slippery when she talks about this, because one of my students asked me one time, was she a real witch? And I was like, yes, no, we don't know. Who are we to say what she was doing and how that is classified? But I like that people are, to some extent, pulling out these pieces of her writing and these pieces of her experience, and taking empowerment from that, the witchcraft that Maricat performs in Castle, and all of the kind of different ways that the women move around the world. I think has really has done a lot to kind of bring her back.
I agree. Faye, were you going to jump in there? Or?
Just that this whole question of was she a witch? We haven't bad-mouthed the movie Shirley yet, and that the very idea that she is popular enough in the 21st century to inspire what is essentially fan fiction, and a movie based on fan fiction is a real barometer of change. But that movie has left people convinced that, of course, not only was she a witch, or the novel convinced them she was a murderer as well. The novel tries to make her the murderer of Paula Weldon, the girl whose disappearance from Bennington had a distant relationship to Hangs a Man. So just a thought there.
Yeah, and actually just to kind of lead into Chris's question, we are moving up towards 5-2, but we'll talk a little bit more. So Chris was asking there about kind of using folklore to talk about Jackson's work, which is obviously something that Shelley in particular is interested in. And I suppose the only thing that I liked about the film was the way that it stressed the way that folklore was seen as something that was perfectly respectable when men were studying it, and not at all respectable when it was associated with women at all, like at all. So I mean, like, Shelley, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how you feel about the links between Jackson and folklore? Or?
I haven't seen the Shirley. I'll just say that I've just not watched it. Maybe I will one day. You know, one of the things that we also haven't brought up, we haven't really talked about Stanley much, but one of the things that that was so compelling for me was, so the same friend who told me I should teach Jackson said, you know, her husband was a folklorist. And I was like, well, yeah, but let me go back and think about that. Right. So, so what that did was allow me to see how Jackson used folklore in a very personal, pointed way, which I thought was lovely and funny, as a way to kind of poke at the Stanley characters that she writes in so much of her fiction. But what it really does for me is it gives me a way to talk about community and a way to talk about belonging in her fiction, because I find that she goes to folklore, both quote unquote real and invented, to help her negotiate boundaries between groups of people, right? Because what folklore is the expressions of a group of people. It's things that people know by being part of a group, right? So folklore is in essence a communal event, right? But she a lot of times divorces folklore from the community in a way that distorts it some. And I find that super fascinating, the way that she is able to use folk culture and folklore in these really precise ways to kind of undercut our ideas about what it means to belong. And that's why I keep coming back to the folk culture in her work.
Great. Much, Shelley. Now we have a few more questions about Stanley's work and also about apocalypticism that I think we probably won't have time for because we are nearly at 5:02. So I think we'll wrap it up there. And if everyone could just give our three speakers, our panelists, a round of applause for a really brilliant start to the event.